Hi, my guest today is Nirupa Rao, who's a botanical illustrator. Her beautiful work has been published in two books, Pillars of Life, Magnificent Trees of Western Ghats, and Hidden Kingdom, Fantastical Plants of the Western Ghats. And she's also illustrated the covers of several Amitav Ghosh's novels. Welcome to Wild Women Interviews, Nirupa.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It's my pleasure. What is the most important lesson life has taught you?
The most important lesson life has taught me, which I think I've learned theoretically, but I'm still trying to implement or learn practically, is that the goal for me is peace rather than happiness. Because, yeah, I think I would like to have that feeling of peace regardless of whether I'm feeling momentarily happy or sad.
That's a very interesting reply. I think we can have a whole conversation about that, but I'm just going to go on to the next. What is your most treasured possession?
So I thought about this as well, and it's not that I don't treasure my material possessions, but there's none that I could think of that I treasured more than others. So I would have to say my health, physical and mental.
And what's your greatest fear?
Losing either of those or both of those.
Okay, well answered. So, this is such a niche field. How did you come into it?
So it's interesting because I actually didn't know that it existed as a field at all. I came at it. I mean, I always liked to draw even as a kid, and I particularly liked painting plants, but I didn't know that that was a specific genre of art in itself. And I was wary of the idea of being an artist because I didn't I had this fairly narrow conception of what an artist could be like. I thought of these abstract artists like Picasso, and I didn't think I fit into that mold. So I didn't study art in college or anything. And it was later on, like actually after college, that I was working at this publishing company in London called Bloomsbury. And they had all of the in the children's department, and they had all of these really fascinating books on like the flora of and the fauna of England, of my first book of birds, my first book of trees, for kids that taught them about like British natural history. And so I think my foray into botanical art was inspired by wanting to make things rather than wanting to produce art in itself. I wanted to make things that I thought people from India could relate to. Um, Makes sense.
Well, you mentioned that there were several books that you had a look at, but you gravitated towards plants more than birds or
Yeah.
mammals. Or what is it about plants?
Well, first of all, I think that that's definitely relatively neglected even in the natural history space. So I definitely think that if you asked the average kid to name their favorite animals, they could rattle off any number and tell you all kinds of facts about them. But if you ask them about their favorite plants, they would be like, stumped. And I think that would be true of adults as well. um, so I I felt that that was something that needed to be addressed. But besides that, um, I think I gravitated naturally towards plants because in my family we actually have a history of botany. So like on my mom's side, her uncle was this botanist named Father Cecil Saldana, who was one of the kind of primary botanists in South India at the time. And he actually led the documentation of the flora of Karnataka in this 60s and 70s. And so, in that sense, plants were already on my radar. And we, I just find them so beautiful, I think. And especially when it comes to illustration, I think that it's a medium that's particularly suited to plants. Animals, I think, are captured really beautifully through photography. But with plants, that hasn't been the case for the most part. Um, I don't think thus far a lot of some photography definitely has been really successful, but like on a larger scale, there's a reason why animals seem to be featured a lot more in sort of wildlife photography nowadays. So I figured that this would be like a nice combination of two interests that I already had.
So I'm going to ask you the question that you just mentioned. What's your favorite plant?
Oh, that's such a difficult question. I think for me, like I really sort of associate plants with their context. So like I don't like to see a plant in a context to which I believe it doesn't belong. If you know what I mean, in the sense that I think that like a place's culture and its history and everything are so intrinsically entwined with the natural life that's um, from there. And the aesthetic of it, the music, like you know, even if you think about how like a tabla was originally made from vegetable, the tabla, or sorry, the gourd of a veena, for instance, or how flutes are derived from reeds that you might find in that particular region. Like all of that culture and history and everything is so intrinsically intertwined with the nature that you can find around in that place. And so I think I would probably have a different favorite plant for like different places. Um, um, yeah, but I really like banyan trees to keep it short.
After that long answer, any particular banyan tree in any particular place?
The one behind you looks really nice. Is that I mean, it seems like a ficus.
No, I meant in any particular place, like a location where you find a specific tree. Do you have a favorite?
A favorite tree. Um, just one. I don't know. Maybe. Well, there's one at you know the GKVK campus in yeah, in Bangalore. It's really huge. I'm actually not sure which species of ficus it is, but it's you wouldn't believe that it's one tree because it covers such a huge area. That's really fascinating.
That's cool. Okay, so when and where did you develop your love for nature? You mentioned that botany runs in the family, but did you have an interest in the wild as such at a young age, or did that come later?
Um, yeah, we definitely. So I grew up in Bangalore, which is a city, and like most others in India, there's not that much access to nature. But and I think specifically like when I was growing up in the 90s, there was so much deforestation, and I mean not deforestation, sorry, like felling of trees in Bangalore that started around that time particularly and has like continued and escalated till now. And my parents would take us to the Western Ghats on every holiday. Um, like so, a bunch of my mom's um, family would be like working at a plantation or maybe you know horticulturalists or something or the other. So we'd go like stay with them at each of the on each of our holidays. So we got to experience a different part of the Western Ghats in yeah throughout every year. And yeah, so I think I automatically associated those trips with like you know freedom from the city kind of thing. So yeah, there was definitely that experience of the wilderness, which increasingly like kids don't have. So that's part of it. I wonder like if they don't have that emotional connection, which for most of us is forged in our childhoods, then I wonder if you'll even kind of see the point in preserving it.
Hmm. So you mentioned that you were interested in plants, you were already drawing as a kid. So what did you study when you went to college?
I studied sociology, so
Wow. So,
neither art,
sorry.
neither art nor botany.
So you're a self-taught artist.
Yeah, I guess you could say so because I didn't study it in college, and I did an online course like in botanical art for a few months. Um, Besides that, I've kind of just picked up everything since then on my own.
So when did you turn professional?
I don't think there was like a firm sort of break. But I finished college and then I worked for a year in like something unrelated. And at the same time, I started teaching myself graphic design. And then since I already like to draw, I would incorporate my illustrations into my graphic design work. And so I started working as a graphic designer for another, like, say, 1.5 years or so, alongside doing like illustration. And then when I got my first big project, or actually, I had two projects which I got around the same time. That's when I realized that I could stop doing kind of commercial work and focus on this entirely.
Cool. So to me, when I think about botanical illustration, I'm thinking of people in the 19th century or earlier who would follow naturalists or botanists on these ship voyages to exotic lands and would paint these, specimens that these guys were collecting. So I would imagine that with the coming of photography, that the role for such an art form becomes irrelevant. But you have obviously um, followed this as a career course, and I guess there are other people who do this as well. So, what is the relevance of botanical illustration in this day and age when we have other ways of recording specimens?
Yeah, so as you said, I think like with the advent of photography, botanical illustration as a field sort of declined, and its focus has become since then a lot more artistic rather than scientific. Of course, with the requirement for the illustrations to be scientifically accurate. Um, but I think I have found that there are specific incidents in which illustration suits the purpose more than photography. For instance, the first book that I did, Pillars of Life, I did it with these two ecologists from the Nature Conservation Foundation, Divya Mudappa and T.R. Shankar Raman, who's called Sridhar by people who know him. But they run like a rainforest restoration program in Tamil Nadu, and the trees that they work with are like 140 feet tall, and of course they're located in like densely forested regions, and they wanted to visually document these trees in some way. But the photographers that they asked initially found it really difficult to isolate a tree from its background. So if you took a photo of them, or actually have, I think I have some images of this which I will show you to show you how the illustrations came out. But they found it really difficult to isolate a tree from the dense surrounding foliage, especially in sufficient detail to actually notice the characteristics which were important. Besides that, the trees are so tall that you couldn't like capture them in one frame. But we could easily solve this through illustration. So that's just like one incident in which I can like safely say that illustration was um, a very appropriate medium. Um, should I show you the images?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So as you can see, this is what a photograph of a tree would look like. Um, and I isolated the same tree through an illustration, and you can see
Oh,
in
wow.
much clearer detail. And then through this process, we documented about like 30 of the. Oh wait, okay, I'll explain the process a little bit to you. So even when I was standing in front of them, it was really difficult for me to see the entire tree because it's so tall. So I would actually have to like look at the buttress up close and then climb up the hill and see the crown rising above the canopy. And it's actually pretty hard to see the intervening portion. And so you kind of just have to imagine what the intervening portion is like, obviously with the help of Divya and Sridhar, who know the species so well that they can tell you what it would be like. So yeah, again, you can isolate that tree very well. And these are some of the other trees that we drew.
These
So
are
you can see
illustrations, right?
all illustrations. Yeah.
Wow.
And with the more unusual shapes, it's harder to imagine what the intervening portion would be because it's not a straight pole. So the ecologist's help is really important there. You can also depict certain other phenomena which are hard to capture photographically. So I'll give you an example of this species, Bononia arborea. It has these seeds which look like this. They kind of have a sort of helicopter-like rotor at the top of it because they're wind dispersed, and that helps them. That feathery thing helps them, float on the wind. So you can faintly see it when you're standing right in front of it, like this wave of seeds floating past you. But it's very difficult to photograph, but you can kind of depict it through an illustration. So yeah, so those are some examples of where it's practically quite um, relevant to use illustration even today. But besides that, I think there is also a quality to illustration which it's a medium which at the moment is increasingly rare, and so it helps you bring attention to a subject that people don't pay that much heed to, just through the fact that it's standing out from the crowd.
Yeah. So the one thing that I noticed about those images that you showed is that there isn't a dead tree limb, for instance. It looks so perfect. And even
Mhm.
some of the other illustrations that you have of flowers, they're just so gorgeous. There is not a hair out of place, quote unquote. So is that, but if I were to go in the wild, that isn't how I would see things. And it seems to be that you have manicured the image to make it seem perfect. And is that a quality that you strive for, where you bring out the best in the tree or the plant?
I think in this particular instance, yes, because they were trying to show what the species looked like, not what the individual specimen looked like. So, for instance, like even if we saw a particular species of Eleocarpus munroi, which was on the side of a hill, um, it would grow kind of tilted because it was located on the side of a hill, and so that's not, and so the shape is looks different from how an Eleocarpus munroi would look like if it was on flat terrain. So that particular specimen isn't necessarily representative of what the species usually looks like. So in the drawing, we might make a composite of what various specimens look like in order to create something that we feel could be representative of that species. So as part of that, yeah, you're creating an ideal type. You're not creating like an actual uh, specimen which may have its defects and its sort of idiosyncrasies. But besides that, I think decay is beautiful and obviously a part of life. So I'm definitely not averse to depicting it. But if I'm doing it for a purpose in which the identification of the species is important, then it's best to represent it when it's in its when it's in a form that's full of life, rather than when it's kind of like graying. Then the color won't be accurate. You know what I mean? Yeah.
So how do you choose your subjects? Like, do they have to be flamboyant and have beautiful flowers, or what about plants that aren't that showy and they're sort of mousy little creatures?
So the subjects that I choose are usually dictated by the project that I'm working on, because I tend to work on I like working on a project basis. So there's usually a narrative that accompanies the set of illustrations. So I rather than just draw like individual species based on personal preference or anything. It's usually dictated by the narrative that I'm trying to tell. So, for instance, in Pillars of Life, we were depicting those trees that are considered to be like the well, key, I guess the keystone kind of species of that region, or the species that kind of uh, mark the forest, the vegetation type of that region. So Divya and Sridhar picked them. For like say the second book that I did, Hidden Kingdom, that is definitely a book in which I specifically picked charismatic, sort of like fun species. Um, yeah, yeah, most of them are pretty charismatic, and so we've got like ceropegias, which are insect trappers, or we've got the elephant yam, which is also it's an interesting plant because it's pollinated by dung beetles, and so it um, practices pollination deception. It sort of present it pretends to be like rotting flesh by emitting the smell of rotting flesh and also like heat, which these beetles are attracted to as a nesting site. Um, so I specifically chose those kinds of plants. But again, the purpose of the book was to bring in people who have no interest in nature, and who have no interest in plants and tend to see plants as sort of passive creatures that don't have agency in the jungles in the same way that animals do. So these plants were chosen to show people a different side of the plant kingdom. But I also chose like some more common plants, like say pepper, which are they're common, they're not rare or anything, but like they still have an interesting story to tell. Or even like basket ferns, which you can find all over the highways in like when you're driving. They're not rare at all, but no one gives them a second glance. So the idea was to show people that plants can be much more fascinating. I can again show you a few pictures of what I mean. Um, I'll just show you one. This is the elephant yam that I was telling you about. So you can see the dung beetles entering the center of the plant.
Wow.
Um, and this is another example of a habitat called the myristica swamps. So of course, like swamp species are unusual because they have aerial roots, and so they're not the norm. They're sort of specific to that region, and they're habituated to that region, and that's why they have these aerial roots that stick out of the ground. But just because they're kind of unusual and fantastical, it doesn't mean that they've been covered in popular press very much, and it doesn't mean that people know what they are. That no one's really heard of them. And so in this image, I wanted to bring them into the foreground. So even though you have, say, like lion tail macaque primates, which you can see in this image, which are spectacular and are endemic to the Western Ghats and favor this habitat, I I decided to put them in the background and have the plants in the foreground, and sort of highlight them for once. Um, yeah, so those.
So why is
Oh,
there so much mist in this painting?
oh, that's because the text goes over those portions.
Okay.
So it's kind of blurred them out so that we can put the text on top and have it be seen clearly. And if I'm painting another a plant like this one, which is fairly unremarkable in comparison, so this is Dimorcarpus longan, which is this is from Pillars of Life. But like because of Divya and Sridhar, we were able to find a way to make a relatively unremarkable plant to show like what's remarkable about it. So this shows the different stages of the leaves. So the red leaves at the top are the fresh flush, and then the middle portion is as they grow a little bit older, and then the ones below are the mature leaves. So you kind of see the stages of this plant in one painting.
I want to ask you, like scientific accuracy is a big part of this because you're doing botanical illustrations, right? And you can teach yourself art. So did you have to teach yourself botany as well to do this?
I always work with like botanists or ecologists or someone who can be a reference for me, because I have become familiar with a lot of botanical terminology, and I think definitely my botany has improved. But I don't think I would consider myself a botanist by any means. So they kind of point out things that I should be aware of.
So, is there a situation where you've ever had to compromise um, scientific accuracy for artistic value?
Um, I think there's one image in Hidden Kingdom, which we wanted to depict sundews, which are a kind of carnivorous plant which you can see in the Western Ghats. And there are three types of sundews that you can find there. Two of which you might find side by side, but one of which is usually found in a similar but different habitat. So you wouldn't actually see all three together. But we did kind of represent them side by side, but we included a caveat at the bottom saying that only these two would be found together. And but this is a sort of recreation so that you can actually see the variety of sundews that are found in the Western Ghats. So even if we do take artistic license, I always point it out because I think that's the purpose of the work that I'm doing. It's not purely artistic.
And what do you do about colors? Do you always find the colors that you need ready made, or do you find yourself mixing colors to get that accurate shade of color?
I always mix colors actually. So I have my palettes here. You can see there's like or this one you can see has this many shades of brown and black. Um, and the paints that I use are I only use actually 10 colors in from the tube, in shades of yellow, blue, and red. And then everything, the greens and the blacks and everything are all mixed.
Right. And green would be the most important color that you use, right?
Yeah, you would think definitely, because there's like so many shades of green in one painting. But then there are ways that you use even like blue or purple or something to highlight green.
Hmm.
And to like so that by comparison it looks more green.
So, are you finding that you're doing more book work, or do you do like, standalone canvases by themselves?
I don't do standalone canvases. I've definitely been asked by a lot of people to do them, and I'm not averse to it, but I just find it more interesting to like the narrative is kind of what interests me a lot, and so I'm trying to tell a story through a collection of images, um, which is harder to do with like a single painting. Um, and but it's not necessarily always in the form of books. Like right now, I'm working on an animation project. Um, so yeah, we'll see how that turns out because I've never done it before. But it's not necessarily just books, but I'm more interested in the storytelling aspect of it than in just individual pieces.
So, how does this animation thing work? Are you working on a computer, or is it like the old style, pen and paper type animation?
So I'm not doing the animation. I do. Are you familiar with Miyazaki's films like Studio? So he's a Japanese animator, and it's all hand drawn animation, but the backgrounds are painted, and then the foreground is animated. So this is a collaboration between me and another um, studio, animation studio. So I would do the background paintings, which would be the jungle, and then they would animate it on top. So this is part of my the National Geographic. It's supported by them, the fellowship that I'm working on now.
So, who are your inspirations?
People, which people are my inspirations? I like Miyazaki a lot. This in general, I like Japanese woodblock or like East Asian woodblock art a lot. And then I also like Fernando Baptista, who is actually the current in-house illustrator at National Geographic. He does a lot of uh, the spreads that you'll find, illustrated spreads that you'll find in that magazine. And I've also like met him a couple of times in person, and he's so generous with his time and his talents and advice and everything. So yeah, he's really great.
That's nice. How do you mentioned a little bit of your process before, but you take photographs for your model to be your model. That's what you draw from. But you also have to be in front of the tree that you're painting, or you come back to Bangalore and you work in your studio. How does it work?
For trees, it's practically, I would say, essential to be there in front of them to sketch the tree, because it's so difficult to discern anything from a photograph. I think like it also depends on the setting. So if it was a shorter tree that was located in an open plain with not much behind it and not much in front of it, you could manage with a photograph alone. Definitely it helps. Everything helps too. If you see it in person, you can also draw it from the angle that you want. You can sketch it from the angle you want it. There's a lot more sort of um, agency that you can employ if you're able to see the specimen in front of you. But when it comes to like rainforest trees, I would say it's like essential to be able to sketch it beforehand. And then but I don't do any of the painting on site, because my process is quite slow and labored, and I don't like really fancy sitting around a bunch of leeches and like painting for hours. Um, and yeah, in any case, I end up painting from that sketch mainly. Um, so like when I was working with Divya and Sridhar, we actually came up with a bunch of parameters that I would use to do it according to their knowledge of the species. So so they would tell me, okay, so this is the average height of the tree, and this is the average percentage of the canopy, of the bole, and of the buttress, and then I would actually like measure it out in my final illustration as well, to keep as closely as possible to whatever data is available about that species. Um, and then for other plants, yeah, you can definitely manage from photographs. And photographs are like essential, like for smaller shrubs and things. You can manage from photographs, but it helps to have seen it in person, because you can make your own sketches, and all of that is gives you a lot more license
So if
to even.
someone were to ask you to paint something in the other end of the world, something that you've never seen, do you think you could do justice to it then if you haven't seen it in real life?
So that actually came up recently, like during the lockdown. There's an American magazine called the Nature Conservancy, which is based in Washington, D.C. And they were working on an article about orchids, North American orchids. And I think the original plan was to photograph them, but then this whole COVID thing happened, and they realized that that wasn't going to work. And of course, also with photography, there are certain limitations in terms of time, like the practicalities of timelines. So uh, you have to factor in the flowering times of those orchids. So you may not actually be able to get them when you need them. So they asked me if I could do it, and they had their own people who vetted the illustrations as well. But I basically worked from photographs that they gave me, as well as old botanical illustrations, which are really useful, because anything that's in an illustration is intentional, and what's in a photograph isn't necessarily intentional. So like if it looks as if a leaf is turning one way, that may not be how it actually is, or that may be how it is in that specific specimen, which is that way because of the climatic conditions, or the geographic conditions of that specific specimen, but that may not be kind of representative of the species. But in anything that's in an old botanical illustration, they've put it there because they think that's the morphology of the plant. So those are really useful, and as well as even like reading the herbarium descriptions of these plants. All of that's really useful in like conceptualizing how it would look. So I did a lot of draft sketches, sent it to them for them to vet the accuracy and everything, and well, they're happy with it. So it's still to be published. I think it's coming out next month. But yeah, they're happy with it.
Wow. So, how many species did you illustrate?
I think we did six, and then there's one. So in this particular spread as well, um, there are two instances in which illustration was kind of more suited to the purpose. One was for the cover spread of the piece, which wanted to show like the variety of North American orchids available, and so it had to be like a sort of montage of all of these different kinds of orchids, which of course is easier done through an illustration than in a photograph. You would have to Photoshop it, and there's actually a bit of a double standard in that regard, in that it's frowned upon to do that in photography, but you can do it in illustration, no problem. um, and then the other instance was they wanted to show the pollination of a particular lady slippers orchid. Because as you would know, the pollination of orchids is particularly interesting because the orchids are kind of um, the shape of the orchid is done in a specific way to uh, allow its pollination to happen. So they wanted to show like a bee entering the orchid pouch and then exiting just under the labellum so that it would get the pollen stuck on its back. Um, and so we did that through a kind of diagram, but like artistic diagram.
Sounds wonderful. So, what are the challenges you face as a botanical illustrator?
I think I think I got into the field at the right time because um, it is an it's not it's a very unusual profession, and I wouldn't have thought like even a few years ago that there was much demand for it, much scope for it, and making a career out of it. Um, and but I think right now it taps into the zeitgeist, like because everyone is so worried about the state of the environment and worried about um, children and educating their children on um, the natural world around them. And so I think I came into it at the right time where I was able to like carve this space for myself. Um, but there is no like straight path, and so you have to figure out everything on a case by case basis. It's not written anywhere, like you have to really figure it out, and there's not like there's not too many people that you can look to for advice or as a role model. Yeah.
Who are the modern day patrons of botanical illustrations? You mentioned National Geographic magazine.
Yeah.
Are there any others?
There's National Geographic magazine. There's also National Geographic Society, which is a non-profit. So they actually do a lot of like funding of projects which aren't necessarily published in the magazine, but it's just like for the general good. And a lot of NGOs. So like Nature Conservation Foundation, for instance, or even Center for Wildlife Studies, which is also based in Bangalore. So I did a project with them called Wild Chalet, which was means Wild School in Canada, and it's basically part of their program to educate kids who live around like national parks on the wildlife around them. Um, and so they had already done a module with animals, but they wanted to include plants as well. And so I did the illustrations and I turned them into games that the kids could like play with and learn from. And of course, I mean, I guess you could have used photographs for those as well. It may have worked just as well, I guess. But it was for the kids, there was the added fascination of, oh my God, someone has drawn this. Someone is like taken the trouble to draw this plant that we know so well, but like no one has really given any importance before this. So there is a kind of human touch to it, which subjectively and anecdotally helps. Um, you asked me what patrons. So patrons are definitely NGOs seem to see the value in it. And then there are these like a lot of funding agencies or magazines which want to just diversify the kind of media through which they represent their work, like the Nature Conservancy, yeah, which is the American magazine.
What are the challenges you face as a woman? Um, I would imagine this is, in a typical sexist way, they would say, oh, this kind of illustration is just made for a woman because it requires such meticulous work. Is that how you find it?
I think in the beginning, especially when I was first starting out, a lot of people would ask, "So this is your full time job, or like, is this your hobby? Are you a student? Are you a volunteer?" Like those are the kind of questions that I would get. I can't say specifically that they were sexist, but I think they were. I mean, I think there was a tinge of sexism to them for sure. Um, and but like as you grow and as you do more projects, you get more credibility, so that helps. And then people don't mess you around. I haven't had like I haven't faced anything that has been really detrimental that way in terms of sexism. The only thing I would say on a practical level is it's really difficult to travel alone, and you always have to have a guide with you. But that's the case for anyone in India in any profession, I suppose, unless you're going to cities. But yeah, if you're going to anywhere anywhere off the beaten path, you have to have a guy with you. Besides that, in a way, it has helped to be a woman, and because again, I think that there's a double standard in this, in which um, I feel like these experimental careers are the careers that like women follow because we're not expected to be the primary breadwinners, and so we can. Uh, we are given that luxury of uh, following career paths that won't necessarily make that much money. So it's kind of tax for the guys as well because I feel like a lot of them don't get to do that.
Hmm. One last question. What is a talent you would like to have?
There are so many. what,
Well, you're already very talented, so you can't have many.
what's yours? I'm curious.
Mine to draw.
Hey, do you draw?
I don't. I mean, if I can copy, I would line by line, but not very well. I can't like draw from memory or be artistic about it.
I think I would like to be more athletic. I think when I see athletes who are in communion with their bodies, that just seems like really fun, like yeah, it, it feels like the idea of swimming really well, and you just like, it's like a form of meditation in a way because you're underwater, there's no sort of ambient noise, and you're just with yourself at peace. uh, so yeah, I like the idea of being like super athletic. Far from it, but
Thank you so much, Nirupa. Lovely talking to you.
you too, Janaki. Thank you for thinking of me.
Not at all. My pleasure.